A young couple disappeared the night they married in 1969, vanishing from a Mississippi town that refused to speak their names again. Officials called it a tragedy, said they likely fled north to escape judgment, but 12 years later, what a group of children found buried in the clay of a receding Tallahatchie River would unearth a secret the town had tried to keep, buried a secret that would drag one of its most powerful families into the light. The summer heat pressed down on Greenville like an unrelenting hand, wrapping every breath in a sticky dose of humidity. Down by the riverbed, a stretch of forgotten earth littered with old beer cans and the vestigages of summer mischief. A group of white boys from the trailer park raced their battered bicycles across the dirt. Kyle Sanders, the smallest of the bunch, trailed behind his thin legs, pumping the pedals like his life depended on it. "Come on, Kyle, you don't want to miss this," one of the older boys shouted, already armed with a handful of rocks to hurl at, the cans strewn along the muddy shoreline, but Kyle wasn't paying attention to the can they propped up on a fallen branch. He was staring at the ground, fidgeting with the worn sandals on his feet that offered no defense against the riverbank swarms of biting gnats. Kyle stumbled when the edge of his sandals snagged on something buried in the clay. He sprawled forward, scraping his elbow on the hardened mud. "Dang it," he hissed, hurrying to his feet before the others could mock him for it. But then his eyes landed on what had tripped him, a glint of something dull and metallic jutting out from under a tangled mess of weeds and river silt. He called, waving the others over as he ducked down to pry at the object. With his small hands, the mud sucked at his fingers as he worked. "What now?" "Kyle, you trip over a worm," one of the older boys teased, walking over with his arms crossed. But his bravado faltered when he saw it, a curved edge of metal, not just some scrap, but a part of something buried deep. It's a car," Kyle said, barely above a whisper. In less than 10 minutes, word spread among the nearby trailers. Old Mr. Grady from 2 plots down was the first adult to see the mess, hobbling his way over on his walking stick. What he saw made his brow furrow tighter than a bad stitch job. "That ain't no junkyard heap," he muttered, backing away with his lips pursed. Sheriff Cal Branson wasn't far behind. "All right, everybody, back it up," he announced, his son, red in face, already showing signs of irritation. "Last thing I need is a pack of busybodies crowding the scene." Deputy Roy McClendon pulled up about 30 minutes after the sheriff, and his faded cruiser parking it just shy of where a fledgling tow team had begun chipping away at the mud surrounding the abandoned hulk. Roy exited the vehicle, slowly straightening the crisp navy collar of his recently issued deputy's uniform. As his boots hit the ground, the car, now partially freed, sat slumped against the earth like a wounded animal. A Plymouth Fury from the late 1960s, most of its cream-colored paint reduced to patches of rust and flaking metal. A tow chain rattled as 2 men secured the vehicle's back end, preparing to drag it onto a flatbed. "You taking bets on how long this thing's been sitting out here?" Roy Cal drawled lazily, his hands resting on his wide hips as he surveyed the scene. He barely turned as Roy walked up beside him. "Not betting, Sheriff, just here to do my job." Roy's response was calm but firm, sharp enough to send a faint rippling tension through the already thick air. A young officer, his uniform almost as crisp as Roy's, emerged from the passenger side of the car, holding something small and tangled in what looked like rotted seat threads. "Sheriff," the officer called, peeling off his gloves. "What you got there?" Cal asked as the object was handed over to him. It was a gold locket, its once polished surface now fogged with tarnish and rust, dangling from an impossibly frayed chain. Inside, Cal pried the clasp apart to reveal 2 water-damaged photos tucked beneath the glass. A young black man and a white woman, their faces blurred but still discernible. The man wore a suit a little too loose in the shoulders, and the woman was practically glowing, clutching his arm, as they stood beneath a grove of ancient moss-draped trees. 2 of the older onlookers gasped from where they peeked through the gathering crowd. "That's the Delacqua girl," one of the women whispered to her companion, her lip quivering slightly. "Ain't no mistake, coincidence." "Nothing more," Cal barked, snapping the locket shut. Could have been anybody's car. He turned sharply, shoving the jewelry into the pocket of his wide-sashed belt, like it was nothing of any importance but something in. Roy's gut churned uneasily as he watched the sheriff's reaction. He'd already seen enough people brush things under the rug, in still water. There was no mistaking the man in the photograph. It was Isaiah Walker, The late summer sun had long since bled into the soft orange hues of dusk when Roy steered his cruiser down the worn gravel road leading to Rose Hollow. This was the last stretch of still water that wouldn't have welcomed him if he hadn't been wearing the badge, and even with it on people up here like to make sure you knew where you stood. Dorothy Walker's small clapboard house stood at the very end of the tree-lined road, blanketed in shadow and surrounded by the quiet hum of evening insects. Roy parked in front of the crooked wooden fence and let himself through, taking a moment to straighten his hat before rapping on the peeling front door. Dorothy, despite her age, opened the door immediately, her sharp hazel eyes wasting no time reading his face. "Roy McClendon, what on earth are you doing out here after dark?" she asked, her voice carrying more curiosity than welcome. "I need to talk with you, Miss Dorothy," he said, the formality of his tone softening the weight of his words. He handed the locket forward carefully, holding it out against his palm. Dorothy's eyes narrowed as she reached for it, her hands trembling by the time her fingers traced the familiar curves of the locket. She opened it with a practiced motion, but froze when her eyes landed on the photograph inside her. Knees wavered, and Roy instinctively reached out, steadying her as the locket fell to the floor with a faint clink. That's Evelyn," Dorothy murmured, her voice breaking into shallow gasps. "I gave it to her that day. A wedding gift, I told her, said maybe this could be a peace offering." She trailed off, staring for a long while down at the locket in silence. Without another word, Dorothy stepped outside barefoot onto the warped wood of the porch. She stood facing the river like it was the only thing tethering her to the moment, her gaze distant and trembling. "I told folks back then my boy didn't just run off," she whispered, quiet enough that Roy had to step closer to hear her. Her hand gripped the railing as she continued, her lips pulling tight around words lined with angry grief. "Some folk always said time heals." "Time?" She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "But time don't hide nothing from God. He turns up the earth and spits the truth back out when he's good and ready." The clock in the sheriff's office clicked past midnight, its rhythm soft but insistent in the suffocating silence. Deputy Roy McClendon figured that silence was safer, a blanket of anonymity he'd need tonight. He swept the room with his eyes once more, ensuring he was alone, before slipping through the frosted glass door of the archives. The metallic scrape of the door latch made him wooze, even though no one else was in the building. This late, his uneasiness hung as heavy as the stagnant summer air. The archives smelled stale, like paper wormed too many times by a weak air conditioner. Folders bulged from overstead cabinets, their spines bent after years of inertia from cases no one cared to revisit. Roy already knew that most of what lay in these cabinets had been neglected for decades. In Greenville, problems often disappeared where accountability should have stepped in. He patted his pocket where his flashlight rested, but thought better of using it. The fluorescent lights above bathed the room in a sterile, cold glow. His fingers danced over faded labels as he searched for the folder. He moved past vandalism, through property disputes, and finally to the narrow section reserved for disappearances. There, he found the label he'd anticipated: Walker Isaiah and Delqua Evelyn, 1969. The file was thin. 2 fragile pages clipped together formed most of it, sitting loose within a larger brown folder. He pulled it out carefully, bracing for what he might find or what he might not. Roy's eyes scanned the contents. The words jumped off the page almost immediately. No signs of foul play, likely fled town together. Family disputes, irrelevant. Roy felt his shoulders stiffen, his pulse quickened. Disappearances didn't sit cleanly on paper without entangling messy family disputes, and he'd never seen a sheriff write off something of this magnitude in so few words. Families drag cases like this through churches and streets long before filing missing person reports. But here was the official conclusion. No need to investigate further, no explanation, no pictures, no follow-up interviews, just typed assumptions. He clenched his jaw. 2 lives evaporated, a black man and a white woman, and the one comfort the law provided was 2 pages of bureaucratic silence as he set the paperwork back into the folder. A signature at the bottom caught his attention. Judge Albert Delqua. The swirl of the letters was distinguished, unmistakable. Albert wasn't a name you needed to say aloud in Greenville. People knew who he was. Wealth largely shielded him from gossip, but it didn't erase what people whispered. When they were feeling bold, he had ties, strong ones, to the Presbyterians, to local business councils, and to circles Roy did his best to avoid. and he'd been Evelyn's father. Roy? Straightened the report wasn't signed by Delocqua just to acknowledge the tragedy of his daughter's disappearance. No, a consultation with the sheriff meant more. It meant leverage, decisions made before facts could even settle. Someone had slammed the creaky archive drawer shut on this case harder than usual. The old chapel sat at the fringe of town, far from where any of the newer developments had been built. It hadn't weathered the decades. Gracefully, the wooden structure sagged like it had been carrying the weight of secrets for too long. Reverend Paul Whitlow's house, tucked modestly near the chapel grounds, had fared no better. The porch beams leaned and weeds sprouted just a few feet from the front steps. Roy spotted Whitlow's vague silhouette through the window, stooped cautious, watching him approach, long before he'd knocked the door open before his knuckles met the wood deputy. The Reverend's voice was soft, but no less wary. I don't get many visitors this time of night, I reckon. Not, Roy said. Just came by with a few questions about an old case. It weighs on me some. Whitlow studied him, his small eyes sharp, though his slouched frame suggested nothing was left of him for fighting. You're cut from a different cloth, ain't you? He hesitated before nodding. Come in, then, but I won't pretend I've got all the answers. Inside the Reverend's living room carried the undeniable scent of damp wood and mothballs. A Bible rested on a wobbly coffee table next to a pair of reading glasses, and stacks of books leaned in precarious towers against the walls. Whitlow gestured to a chair and settled himself into the flat-backed rocker nearby. You married him, didn't you? Roy asked without preamble. The Reverend didn't flinch, not quite, but his fingers tightened on the chair's arms. I did. Roy opened the evidence bag and placed the locket on the table. It caught a stray beam of faint light from the single lamp in the room. Whitlow glanced at it and closed his eyes like the sight had called forth ghosts who made you stop talking about it. That's bold, son. The Reverend shifted forward in his chair. Why are you dredging all this up? Because it was never dredged up before. Reverend Sheriff Branson ain't interested. But I think you already know why I'm not walking away. A deep sigh escaped the old man. His hand hovered near the locket, but never touched it. That was a mistake from the start. That marriage, they were good kids, seemed honest. But the world? You mean this town? His lips tightened, though Roy couldn't say if it was approval or fatigue. We kept it small, just me, them and a witness from one of the colored congregations. Evelyn asked me herself to set it up quiet. They didn't want kindness, they wanted safety. He trailed off before adding, but our kind of ceremony don't come with safety, does it? You were threatened. Whitlow held Roy's gaze for the first time. That evening warned. He murmured, threatened. Do those words mean different things? Deputy, they do if you've got a family to protect. Roy answered cautiously. The Reverend covered his face with one frail hand. When his voice emerged, it barely rose above the soft creaks of the wood around them. I told him, leave right after the vows go south, don't let me know where. They took her car. A Plymouth Fury. Whitlow nodded, had it decorated in ribbon. That's how freshly they tied the knot. Roy leaned forward, elbows bracing on his knees. You think maybe it was an accident? And Whitlow chuckled bitterly, his voice suddenly sharper, angrier. His hands folded tight along the sides of the rocker. No, son, I think it was a warning. The words expanded between them like a ripple in the air. Whitlow finally pushed himself up from the chair, moving toward the door to signal the end of the conversation. Roy didn't push. Truth had a habit of showing jagged edges when it surfaced by the time Roy reached for his flashlight on the way out. One thought carved itself deep into his conscience. Whoever made this warning meant it as a lesson. Do you think Reverend Whitlow is telling the full truth, or is there something he's still hiding? Comment below. Will Roy uncover what really happened to Isaiah and Evelyn all those years ago, and finally bring closure to Dorothy? Give the video a like and keep watching to find out. Also, let us know where you're watching from today. The woods at the edge of Walker's Parish clung to the daylight, the trees huddled thick and bristling with summer growth. Roy pushed through the brush flashlight in one hand and a machete in the other, slicing vines and undergrowth that tried to keep the path hidden. His boots left deep tracks in the spongy soil still damp from last week's rain. The air smelled of moss and decay, and sweat lined his collar, soaking into the fabric of his uniform. He hadn't expected there to be much left of the chapel. The locals hadn't spoken its name in years, not even in passing. Reverend Whitlow's directions had been vague. just mentions of an old footpath that wound through cedars to a clearing. Still, as he stepped into the open, there it was, or what was left of it. The roof had caved in long ago, leaving jagged beams exposed to the elements. Brambles crept up the walls and moved into the rotting lattice of stained glass windows shattered beyond recognition. The once pristine white paint had flaked away, leaving streaks of gray and raw wood. All that stood intact was the steeple rising crookedly, like it too wanted to abandon the weary structure. Below? Roy walked toward the threshold, trying not to think. His flashlight beam swept across crumbled pews and the splinters of a pulpit, now nothing more than broken planks riddled with termite holes. Roy stepped outside, inhaling the wet smell of trees and creek water. He circled behind the building, following a clear indentation in the ground leading toward a thicket. The path narrowed, split by jagged roots, forcing him to crouch as he moved through. And then in that moment, his breath caught just under the brambles and waist-high weeds half buried under soft clay. A glint of metal flickered. His flashlight's beam. He dropped to one knee, his fingers brushed against it, prying loose what he could disturbing tangled roots and hardened mud. He pulled something small free from the ground, shards thin and curling coated with dirt. Roy spat into his palm and rubbed at them furiously. The flashlight now trained on his hand. The paint came flaking away, revealing a faded familiar cream. His body stiffened, shaking. Roy brushed further and uncovered more, a shattered piece of reflecting glass, a crushed headlight casing. He had to force himself to look further. Back toward the disturbance, the shapes embedded in the dirt took form, long curves of warped chrome flattened under time and weight. He crouched low, his knife skimming the earth delicately until his fingers struck something sharp, the license plate part of it. At least, he guided it loose, holding it up under the concentrated glow of his flashlight. The numbers stared back at him. LO 694. Roy stood as though all the air had left his lungs. He cradled the fragment for a long moment before wrapping it tight in a handkerchief and slipping it into his coat pocket. The locket, the car, and now this. It was everything the town had tried to bury, everything just waiting for the wrong or right man to uncover it. The sheriff's office was quiet when Roy walked in, his boots squeaking faintly against the freshly mopped floors. Sheriff Branson's door hung slightly open, but Roy pushed it wide before he could second-guess himself. Branson sat behind his desk, reading over incident reports with his glasses perched low on his nose. He didn't bother looking up. "You knock McClendon, or you always been this rude?" Roy tossed the bundle of evidence onto the desk, the license plate fragment clanging loudly against the wood. Branson's eyes snapped up, his expression hardening the second he saw what Roy had brought him. "That's from a Plymouth Fury," Roy said, ignoring the undercurrent of tension crawling into the edges of the room. He jabbed a finger at the license plate fragment. "Evelyn Delqua's registration? I found it near what's left of the old chapel." Branson leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under the weight of his shift. "Tell me you didn't go digging where you weren't supposed to. I went looking for the truth." Roy shot back, his voice sharp and cutting. "Which apparently you and this whole damn department couldn't be bothered with the papers." On Branson's desk shifted as the sheriff slapped a hand down on the bundle, leaning forward. "You're fixing to start trouble in a town that already made peace with this." His tone was low and deliberate, but his eyes were as close to dangerous as Roy had ever seen. "You call this making peace?" Roy countered, arms crossed tight over his chest. "Two people vanished, their families broken apart. Peace ain't when the truth stays buried. It's when it comes out." Branson exhaled through his nose, long and slow, then jabbed his finger at the door. "Go home, McClendon. You've got a job to do here, something you're about to lose. If you keep pushing, this ain't a case. It's history, dead and buried. And unless you wanna join it, walk away." Roy didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Branson, steady as they burned into the heavy-set man behind the desk. When it became clear Branson wasn't budging, he turned sharply and left without another word. Roy eased his truck into his apartment complex lot after midnight and killed the lights. An uneasiness had been swirling in his chest since he'd walked out of the sheriff's office. Branson's reaction was bad, but what was worse was the way his words had felt, less like a warning and more like a promise. He didn't notice the faint edge of broken glass glittering against the streetlight until he opened the door to his unit. The lock had been forced, the handle left half dangling as if someone had tried to patch it poorly. pushing the door open with his shoulder. Roy instinctively reached for his sidearm as his flashlight swept the space drawers had been emptied and his couch cushions were slashed and hanging loose. Cabinets were open, papers from his desk lay scattered and torn. His breath came heavy as he moved further in his focus. Sharp, something was wrong about it. They had gone through everything, but nothing was gone. His badge was still on the desk where he had left it that morning. The license plate fragment was still in his pocket. This wasn't someone looking for valuables. He'd been sent a message. The next day, Roy paid another visit to Dorothy across from him. Dorothy Walker leaned heavily against the threadbare armchair in her small living room, her silver curls disheveled from sleep. Even in her quiet presence, the room felt steady, as though her being there rooted it into the earth, a stark contrast to the chaos gripping Roy's mind. "They tossed my place last night," Roy said. Finally, his voice broke the tension like a blade. Dorothy's lips tightened, the sharpness in her gaze softening into something more fragile. "You still got what matters?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Dorothy exhaled, shaking her head faintly. "Then their scared deputy." She leaned forward, now gripping the armrest as if to reinforce her words. "Isaiah used to say something every time folks told him to let things go." Roy tilted his head. "Waiting when truth stays buried too long," she said firmly. "The ground starts to rot." Her words clung to the air like smoke. Roy swallowed hard, his jaw setting tighter. "Do you believe it's rotted enough?" he asked. Dorothy's gaze met his steady and unblinking. "It's time." Roy's truck coughed and stuttered as it rolled up the winding dirt path to Magnolia Hill. He parked several feet from the house, climbing out slowly and adjusting his hat, dust kicked up around his boots as he stepped toward the porch. Each step felt deliberate. The judge likely already knew he was coming. Someone like Albert Delacroix always seemed a step ahead. By the time Roy reached the door, it opened with a slow, deliberate swing. A man stood silhouetted in the frame, a groundskeeper by his plain clothes, his tanned, weathered face giving away decades of labor. The man's expression held no welcome, but he stepped aside silently, allowing Roy entrance without a word. "You visit unannounced, Deputy McClendon." The voice came smooth and sharp from deeper in the house. Judge Delacroix appeared from an adjoining room, walking with deliberate grace. At 73, there was no mistaking his age. Deep creases traced his features and his hairline had receded almost entirely, but nothing about his bearing suggested frailty. This was a man who still carried his authority like a cloak. He extended a hand in the direction of the sitting room, his smile wide but calculated. "Come, we may as well avoid any assumptions about why you're here." Roy stepped into the sitting room, careful not to survey the place too visibly. The judge sat first, his old frame easing into a high-backed armchair that seemed as immovable as he was. Roy remained standing. He didn't feel like sitting. "You made quite the stir," bringing up Evelyn's name again. The judge laced his fingers in his lap, watching Roy closely. "I heard from Sheriff Branson says, you have quite the interest in old tragedies." "Interest in the truth, Judge," Roy replied, keeping his tone firm. "Well," now the judge drawled, "sometimes the truth is that people move on. Evelyn was young, naive, got swept up in something she couldn't understand one minute. You're courting danger the next, you're down the wrong road. That's what this was. No use digging through the ashes." Now Roy's gaze didn't leave him. His hands stayed clasped at his side, steady as they'd been outside the ruins of the chapel. "What about the car?" Delacroix's expression didn't change at first, but Roy caught it, the faint twitch in the man's jaw, the way his eyes hardened for half a beat before he spoke again. "That car was stolen," he said, his voice lower. Now words deliberate. "Wouldn't surprise me if it got dumped in the river like the rest of their foolish dreams." Roy let the words hang, his silence deliberate. He watched as the judge shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his shoulders as though the air had thickened. Still, the smile returned, half charred, but present. "This case you're stirring up, Deputy, it's not going to bring you anything but trouble. Some things are better left alone." "Trouble doesn't scare me, sir." The words came, measured, calm, and direct. The tension crept higher for a heartbeat. Then the judge chuckled, a low, humorless sound that reverberated off the room's pristine walls. As the groundskeeper came to escort Roy out, the judge's parting words lingered. "Good luck with your crusade, Deputy." His tone carried neither encouragement nor mockery. It felt more like a warning or a dare. As the groundskeeper had escorted him out that afternoon, Roy's eyes caught details they hadn't meant for him to see. While passing behind the house, he'd glimpsed a small shed built apart from the rest of the estate, perched awkwardly at the tree. The padlock on its door gleamed sharp in the sunlight. Something about its presence had stuck in Roy's mind. Most sheds didn't warrant that kind of lock, not unless there was something worth hiding. Now, the area around the shed was silent. Roy clicked his flashlight on keeping its beam tight and low as he approached the structure. The lock, as he'd suspected, remained neatly in place. He steadied his breath, pulling from his pocket a slim tool. It wasn't his first time dealing with locks that weren't meant to yield company. The padlock gave after a minute or two of coaxing, falling into his hand with a muted clatter. He opened the door, his flashlight cutting. Through the stale darkness inside the shed smelled of old gas and mildew. Thick and cloying tools lined the wall. Shovels, picks, shears, some rusted from disuse, others surprisingly well maintained. Rusted gas cans sat in one corner, their labels barely legible. Then his light caught something else. It rested on the floor near the back wall, tucked beneath a plywood workbench, a tightly rolled tarp strewn with dirt and suspiciously sturdy, compared to the disarray surrounding it. Roy stepped closer, his pulse picking up. Bending down, he grabbed the edge of the tarp and dragged it forward. It was heavier than it looked. Carefully, he began unrolling its layers one by one. The first object revealed took his breath away. It was unmistakable, a Bible with Isaiah Walker's name engraved on the lower corner of the cover. The edges of its pages were stained. Their water damage mingled with what Roy suspected was something far worse. Roy's hands hesitated only briefly before he unwrapped the tarp further. The next item fell free, a small glossy paper preserved far better than anything else. It was a printed church bulletin, its edges well worn but intact. His eyes scanned its contents, and there they were. Isaiah Walker and Evelyn Delqua, listed as the couple married that night in 1969. All the proof anyone needed, or rather all the proof someone had been keen to keep hidden. You knew Roy whispered to no one at all. As he knelt there, his breath slowed, grounding him. Though his heart thundered, you knew all along. The judge's words from earlier suddenly rang clear. That charm, that menace beneath every sentence it held. Clarity, now everything from that stolen car to the chaos that followed had been deliberate. This wasn't negligence or coincidence. The judge had known every step of the way. The box sat on Dorothy Walker's porch, like it carried the weight of the entire town. Isaiah's Bible, stained but unmistakable, rested neatly beside the folded church. Bulletin word moved faster than Roy expected. Maybe people knew before he did. Maybe the air had shifted, or maybe someone saw him the night he returned from the Delqua estate with the tarp tucked under his arm. Either way, Stillwater felt smaller now, every corner brimming with whispers that seemed to grow louder with each passing hour. Dorothy leaned against the porch railing, her gaze unfocused as the late afternoon sunlight fell unevenly across her face. She'd barely spoken since Roy left her that morning, with the box only nodding when he handed it over now. As neighbors began to arrive, murmuring soft condolences that felt more like apologies, she finally lifted her head. "Set yourselves down," Dorothy said, her voice as steady as the boards beneath her feet. The porch creaked with the weight of folding chairs dragging into place. The first to come were a few old-timers men who had known Isaiah as a boy, now moving slower with the years, but no less sharp in their recollections. Then came the women clutching small baskets of cornbread and mason jars filled with sweet tea, their hands lingering over Dorothy's shoulder as they passed by even children, school-aged and wide-eyed with the kind of silent curiosity born from overheard hushed whispers, at home gathered near the edge of the steps. The story started slow, forks, scraped plates. The hum of cicadas filled in any lulls, but then it came in fragments, small moments growing bolder, like smoke building into firelights up on Magnolia Hill. A man with a white didgeridoo beard said, after a long sip of his tea, his words settled over the group. "I remember, 'cause my father told me not to go wandering too much traffic going in and out of there that night." Dorothy nodded, not breaking her distant stare toward the woods. "Makes sense, that's what Isaiah told me before they left for the church. Said her people wouldn't just let her walk free." Her voice didn't waver, but something hollow grew behind it. A younger man sitting off to the side cleared his throat. His name was Henry at the time of Isaiah's disappearance. He'd been just a kid. "I don't know what they were up to, but I used to fish down by the river back then. Just at dusk, he said nervously, scanning the faces around him like he wasn't sure he should continue. I heard screaming, blood curdling like someone begging. The crowd shifted uneasily. One woman next to him whispered the Lord's name under her breath. "What did you do?" Another asked, her body leaning forward as though willing the words to come slowly. "Nothing." Henry admitted shame pulling down the edge of his tone. "I was 12, ran home so fast I didn't tell a soul." Dorothy lowered her head briefly, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair. Her voice steadied the air like the creak of falling boards. 12 or 60. "Don't matter," she said softly, looking up at Henry with calm resolve. "Those things you hear and see, they got roots, even if you don't think it now." The stories continued to rise and fall, stitches in a tapestry that everyone on the porch contributed to. They talked about the white men posted at the edge of Magnolia Hill, gathered with shotguns and drinking from flasks. They acknowledged the unspoken power of the Delqua family. The rumors that swirled about Judge Delqua even before Evelyn disappeared. Dorothy sat there, her presence grounding the room as pieces of the past became impossible to ignore. Roy pushed through the sheriff's department doors with the same restless energy he always carried, but he stopped abruptly at the sight of Cal Branson leaning against his desk. Arms crossed, an expression tighter than Roy had seen in years. The usual air of lazy dismissal in his face had been replaced with something heavier, something purposeful. The door creaked as it shut behind Roy, but Cal didn't move. "We need to talk," Cal said finally about what Roy played along, though he knew he'd known the moment the word complaint drifted toward him sometime. Between his morning coffee and the sidelong glances of his fellow officers, Cal reached for a thin packet of paper resting on his desk and thrust it toward Roy. "About this," he said. Roy scanned the document, recognizing the judge's name at the top. The words interference, harassment, and professional misconduct littered the page like accusations meant to sting. "More than proof this isn't about me," Roy said, tossing the complaint back onto the desk. "This is about what I found." "Not anymore," Cal replied brusquely, pushing the paper back toward him. "It's about the Delqua family saying you're digging too deep. You know they've held this town by the throat for decades. You think they're gonna let you mess with that?" Roy's jaw clenched. "Let me guess, you want me to drop it." "I'm telling you to drop it," Cal interrupted his tone. Left no room for argument. "Son, you're digging up things you don't want to deal with and they don't stay buried." "Easy?" Cole stood upright, now his years of authority pressing forward in his posture. "You got a choice. Melendon, drop it, or turn in your damn badge. I ain't gonna sit around while you make this department a mess." The room was too quiet. Roy ground his teeth once staring at the older man. "Fine," he said, his voice cold. He placed his badge on the desk and turned on his heel. He didn't bother looking back. Dorothy sat on her porch as Roy climbed the steps, his shadow longer than it had been earlier in the day. She tilted her head, sensing the weight in his silence lost. "Your badge, didn't you?" Dorothy said, more a statement than a question. He leaned against the railing. "Shoulders tight. Don't need it if it means looking the other way." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze sharp and steady. Isaiah always said, "When truth stays buried too long, the ground starts to rot. You want justice, boy. You don't ask for it." She leaned forward, her voice iron cast, and, "Sure, you tear it loose from their hands. Otherwise it'll never belong to you." Roy nodded, once her words stitching themselves into his chest. "Thanks, Dorothy." Roy stood in front of his mirror, the room dimly lit and cluttered from the restless energy driving his morning. He pulled his father's old church suit off the hanger, the fabric heavy against his shoulders, bearing the weight of a memory he hadn't touched in years. He pinned Isaiah's old badge just below his lapel, straightening his tie with deliberate care. In the reflection, he didn't just see himself. He saw something carrying a promise, a refusal to quit. He nodded once at the mirror, grabbed his keys, and stepped outside into the waiting sun. The drive to Jackson stretched ahead of him, but this wasn't just a ride. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. Every mile between him and that office carried more than the past. It carried the fight for the truth. The morning air carried an unusual chill as Roy climbed out of his truck near the dry stretch of the Tallahatchie River. Around him, the quiet hum of human activity began to fill the space, the kind that didn't mark a crowd, but a purpose, a few. Neighbors from Dorothy Walker's circle moved among the reeds and mud, with tools borrowed from garages and sheds. Dorothy stood off to the side, arms folded, her gaze locked on the ground, as if watching for signs the earth had plans to speak. John Hayes was the taller of the two federal investigators, his build lean but his posture rigid, making both his military past and mistrust of the unfamiliar evident in every movement. Nathan Joyner, older but broader, wore a frayed leather jacket and kept a sharp eye on the edges of the group. Both had arrived quietly in Stillwater, at Roy's urging a pair of observers to avoid drawing more unwanted attention. They didn't carry badges or guns, just the kind of quiet strength that anticipated trouble before it showed itself. "You sure this is the spot?" Hayes asked, his voice low, his eyes cutting toward Roy. Dorothy answered before Roy could. "This is where his locket washed up," she said simply. Joyner didn't respond to the sentiment, but his hands shifted over his folded arms. "Mud's thick," he said instead. "Anything under, there's gonna take work to drag up." "We'll dig," Roy said firmly. "Already?" Stepping toward the riverbed, he held a shovel in his grip, like the weight steadied him more than it strained him. "Dorothy knows this spot better than anyone here. We keep to her directions and see what turns up." The digging began slowly. Careful and deliberate spades sunk into the mud, releasing faint damp shudders of decay. The air seemed heavier with each layer peeled back, each flash of breaking root or glint of buried debris. It wasn't long before Hayes raised a hand to stop the movement, crouching low over something faint but unnatural, woven through the mud here. He said flatly, his brow pinching as he reached for the edge of something pale, protruding. His movements were deliberate, his gloved fingertips brushing at the object until its shape emerged slowly into view, strikingly stark against the dark clay, the curve of bone. The space around them tightened. Voices silenced now as more shovels moved toward the area, bit by bit. The layers of the riverbed surrendered their history. It took almost an hour for the first full skeleton to reveal itself, curled into the hardened depths like its resting had never been. Peaceful, the bones were slim, delicate in their proportions, brittle at the edges where time had worn them too small to be him. Dorothy murmured faintly, watching over the movement, but not stepping closer. Hayes nodded grimly. His flashlight beam caught on something near the hand. A faint metallic gleam wrapped loosely around what remained of the slender finger bones. He crouched again, his gloves coated in mud, and gently pulled the object free. A wedding ring. Roy stepped closer as Hayes turned it over the engraving, caught beneath their flashlight, beams forever. I.W. Dorothy's breath hitched audibly. Though she didn't speak, she didn't need to. The name carved on that ring was enough to draw the weight in the air, tighter than it had started only minutes later on the far side of the site. A second set of bones emerged. These were broader, taller. The shoulders had collapsed inward, the fragments of ribs sharp and uneven. Time had pushed them closer to the tree roots, tearing through the mud. But it didn't take more to tell whose these were. Dorothy's knees buckled faintly when her gaze shifted. This time she didn't crumble, though her voice stayed steady as she muttered under her breath, low and fierce after all this time. Roy glanced at her, once then knelt beside the larger skeleton, his jaw set, his throat tight. Hayes's voice broke the moment, calm but firm. "That's 2 sets, he said. "Seemed like you were right." Deputy, by the time forensics teams arrived from Jackson, rumors in the small town had already grown. Legs, news spread wherever people gathered at the diner on Main Street, inside corner stores, whispered along the church pews before Sunday services. 2 bodies dug out of the Tallahatchie, 2 buried truths left too close to the surface. The reports from the team who came to inspect the remains built a clearer picture. The ages in the builds were consistent with Evelyn Delqua and Isaiah Walker, young lovers taken from the world too early. X-rays showed broken ribs, signs of blunt trauma. The death wasn't clean. Neither had been shot, but their bones told a story of violence. Dorothy's front porch filled back up after the news spread. Her small home became a place of congregation, of careful words of grief and remembering. But on the other side of town, tension thickened in homes, where the news was met with narrowed gazes and sour muttering. Judge Delqua waved the reporters who plagued him off his property. The cracks in Stillwater widened no longer. Quiet Roy's knuckles tapped gently on the door to Clara Hensley's house. It wasn't far, just 2 streets from where Evelyn used to walk to meet her on summer afternoons. Clara answered slower than expected, her dark, weary eyes peering out from behind the worn screen door. Roy introduced himself quickly, his hat in hand, and she opened the door, stepping aside to let him in. He sat across her kitchen table, his voice careful but decisive. "Mrs. Hensley, I know Evelyn was your best friend. I want to understand what happened. Then what she told you." Clara shifted in her chair, her gaze flickering between him and the window nearest the corner of the room. "Evelyn didn't tell me everything she said finally, but I knew something was wrong." She hesitated, biting her lip faintly, her hands gripping her knees beneath the table. "She was scared," Clara said softly. "Terrified that week. Her daddy said he'd rather bury her than let her take Isaiah's name." The words landed like stones, heavy and unmoving. "I thought it was just anger." "Didn't know he'd." Roy nodded faintly, letting the silence stay. Clara reached into a small tin on the counter. Retrieving a folded sheet of paper, she passed it across the table. "It's hers. She gave it to me the day before the wedding," she said. Roy unfolded it with care, Evelyn's delicate handwriting still clear, despite the passage of time. "I don't know if my daddy will ever forgive me for loving Isaiah, but I'd rather die free than live obedient, Reverend Paul." Whitlow's once steady hands trembled as he poured tea into the chipped porcelain cup in front of Roy. The parlor of his small, weather-worn home felt smaller than usual, filled with a silence that stretched between words. Roy sat still, watching the older man with quiet intensity, waiting. Whitlow set the teapot down with a faint clink against the scratched tabletop, his fingers lingering on its cracked handle. When he finally spoke, his voice was muted, almost lost beneath the weight of guilt that seemed to live in his chest. "I'd been scared. Something like this would come back one day." He said his words heavy, deliberate. Roy leaned forward, slowly. "You know the truth, don't you, Reverend?" The Reverend stared down into his tea as though the swirling surface held answers he could only summon by looking away from Roy. "I told you before," he murmured. "I married them. I thought maybe it would be safe that they could slip away. Find peace somewhere far from here, but this town doesn't forgive. Not for something like that." Roy's voice softened, though his posture didn't relax. "What did you see that night?" Whitlow's breath caught faintly, and his fingers clenched tighter around the edge of his chair. When he looked up, his face was pale, but his gaze was sharp, with a creeping kind of dread. "I feared for my life," he said, almost choking on his words. "I still do, but I feared God more." Roy said nothing, waiting his patience working its way into the preacher's defenses. He stayed silent as Whitlow shifted forward slightly, his tone dropping into a whisper, like the walls themselves carried ears that night after the ceremony. Whitlow began. "I came out of the chapel to make sure no one had seen the car as they drove off. They were supposed to be gone already, but out in the trees near the path, I saw a group of men. White men. They were standing around talking, holding flashlights low. One of them turned, and I saw his face clear as day. He swallowed audibly, Albert de Loqua. For a brief second, Roy's calm exterior faltered, his mouth tightening, but he kept his voice steady. "You're sure? Positive?" Whitlow rasped, his eyes wide and certain, and he wasn't alone. There were others, men I'd seen before from the clan. I didn't see any hoods, but I knew who they were, always sitting in the back pews on Sundays, wearing that air of spite-like perfume. He trailed off his hands, gripping the edge of the table as though anchoring himself against the memory. I froze, rooted right where I stood. They didn't see me, not in the dark, but something wasn't right. A couple of them had rifles slung over their shoulders, and the way Delqua talked, it wasn't calm, like he just stopped for a chat. He was mad, furious, I think. I think they followed her. Whitlow shut his eyes tightly. I wanted to stop them, but I knew what that would mean for me, for my wife, my kids. So I ran back inside, locked myself in that chapel, and prayed. I prayed because I knew what evil looked like, and it stared back at me that night. The Delacroix property looked quieter than the first time Roy had approached it. The sprawling estate seemed smaller now, caged in by the tension hanging over the town and the whispers that were carried into every corner of Stillwater. Roy stepped out of his truck, Hayes and Joyner flanking him, their presence casual but purposeful. This time they carried the silent weight of authority in their pocket, a signed court order tucked neatly into Roy's jacket. The shed stood like it had before, inconspicuous and still tucked near the edge of the tree. Everything about it tried to seem unimportant, but Roy knew better. The padlock had been replaced after Roy's prior break-in, but this time there would be no sneaking, no whispers of doubt. Hayes swung a crowbar, like it was an extension of his arm. The lock cracked open, clattering to the ground with faint reverberation, and Roy stepped forward, first flashlight in hand, his posture tense but steady. The smell hit them first earth and mildew mixed with the faint sour burn of old gasoline. It wasn't much more than it had been before, tools and dust, vague signs of neglect, but Roy knew this time they weren't here to look at the surface. Joyner moved straight to the floor, crouching low as he rapped his knuckles against the wooden planks. The sound echoed faintly in one spot near the rear corner, more hollow than the rest. He looked up at Roy, his unspoken signal sending a jolt through the tension in the room. Together, they pried at the edge of the boards until a section of the floor gave way, revealing a compartment built deep into the base of the shed. What they found wasn't just evidence, it was a glimpse into the past. Raw and ugly, the base of a burnt cross lay at the bottom of the compartment, its edges charred, blackened from fire. Next to it, half folded but unmistakably preserved, was a church marriage license. Evelyn's name and Isaiah's were smeared faintly by fingerprints, but they could still be read. The paper's edges were starred with soot, its importance clear even among the chaos of its surroundings, but it was the third and final item that made the air in that shed. Heavier than the barrels of blood-stained white gloves beside it, Roy reached into the compartment. Hands trembling faintly and lifted it up a clan robe, its ivory hue dulled over time but no less grotesque in its symbolism. His eyes scanned the fabric slowly until he saw it stitched neatly in the collar, Ad Albert de l'Aqua. The town split itself along its fault lines as the news broke. It wasn't a single story. Now it was a clear rupture, a battle between old loyalties and impossible truths. Some called it lies. Others a witch hunt orchestrated to discredit a pillar of the community. But nothing kept the whispers at bay. This time they grew louder, connecting names from back then to their present lives. For the first time in years, people spoke openly about Evelyn and Isaiah, about what everyone had already whispered years ago, but hadn't dared to say outright. Judge Delac stood in front of reporters just outside the courthouse, his face schooled into a picture of outrage. "This is a shameful smear against me, against my family's name, and against this town," he barked, his voice carrying over the sea of cameras. "I have nothing to do with the tragedy of those two unfortunate young people, and anyone who says otherwise is digging for stories that don't exist." But he wasn't fooling everyone anymore. Roy's boots felt heavier than usual as he stepped into the sheriff's office, the echoes of the past days ringing in his ears, the worn report from 69, the locket, the remains in the riverbed, the journal entry, all of it pressed into him. It all led to Delacroix. There wasn't a doubt left. Sheriff Branson sat behind his desk, his head low as he wrote his pen scraping against the paper. When he finally looked up, the look in his eyes wasn't surprised, if anything. It was resigned. "You got everything," Roy said, simply, tossing the evidence folder onto Branson's desk. "The remains, the robe, his initials. If that's not enough for you, I don't know what is." Branson stared at the folder, but his hands didn't make a move to touch it. "Hell, no, I'm not arresting him," he said flatly, his voice low but firm. "But I'm not going to stop you from doing what needs doing." Roy nodded, once sharp understanding more than words could accommodate. He turned and walked out, the weight of the truth falling squarely across his shoulders. The air in the small office was heavy with tension. As the plan took shape, Roy leaned over a spread of notes and maps pinned to the wall. His hands braced on the desk across from him. Hayes and Joyner stood silent, their expressions sharp and cautious. This wasn't a standard operation, and they all knew it. Delawa wasn't just a man, he was an institution. A name is woven into the fabric of Stillwater, but now that fabric had been frayed, and this was the moment to pull the thread from the seams, completely. Roy gestured to the pinned map. Every Sunday night, he heads to that hunting lodge near the woods. No guest, no staff, just him alone. We know his routine, and we know he keeps it. "You think he'll take the bait?" Hayes asked, arms crossed, his skeptical eyes fixed on Roy. "He won't be able to resist," Roy said confidently. "All he needs is a reason to think there's still proof out there, proof that could clear him. He glanced over his shoulder at Clara Hensley, who sat quietly near the door. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale with tension when Roy had approached Clara. Earlier that day, he hadn't minced words. He'd laid out the plan plainly. If they wanted Delacroix on record, they needed to draw him into a trap. The mention of Evelyn's journal page, the one Clara had kept folded in her possession for decades, was the perfect lure. "You don't have to do this," Roy said, softly, crouching slightly to meet Clara's gaze. "But if you call him, pretend like you want to help. He'll listen a story about something Evelyn left behind. That's the one thing he'll still come running for." Clara had stayed silent for a long beat, the weight of her own guilt and memories catching up to her. But then her shoulders straightened and her voice, firm but quiet, broke the tension. "I'll do it not for him, but for Evelyn." The phone call was brief. Clara had been calm and deliberate, playing her part. Well, she told the judge about a journal page Evelyn had left her in secret. The very journal page he'd hoped would never surface. The mention of it shook him just enough, and before long the meeting was arranged for Sunday night at the hunting lodge. The hunting lodge was isolated, sitting deep in the woods along a narrow gravel path that twisted down a ridge. It was the kind of place where deals were made and private secrets pressed into dark corners and history rewritten among men who thought themselves immune to consequence that was about to change. Roy sat in the driver's seat of his truck, parked just out of sight from the lodge's clearing. His heart thrummed steadily, though the calm he projected outward masked the fire burning in his chest. He adjusted the recorder hidden beneath his shirt, the wire taped along his ribcage, and checked the mic pinned discreetly to his collar. Hayes walked up to the window, leaning slightly as he spoke in a low tone. "Radios are live. We're posted along the tree line. We'll move in when you give the signal." Roy nodded, exhaling slowly as he reached for the small leather journal tucked into the passenger seat beside him. It wasn't Evelyn's real journal, just a decoy for the confrontation, but its weight still felt like more than paper and leather. It felt like a promise, trying to quiet the doubt circling the edges of his mind. Roy opened the truck door, stepping into the cool night air. The lodge was dimly lit when Roy approached. Deke was already there, sitting at a wooden table with a whiskey tumbler in hand. The judge looked as put together as ever, his tailored jacket and crisp white shirt, betraying not a single hint of the fear or guilt that should have weighed on him. A pistol sat conspicuously on the table beside his drink, a calculated display of power. He didn't look up immediately. When he finally did, his expression darkened into something unreadable. "You're not Clara," Delacroix said plainly, suspicion clawing at his tone. "What the hell's this about?" Roy didn't sit. He stayed standing by the door, resting one hand on the back of a chair, his other gripping the journal. He gauged the man carefully, looking for any crack in the judge's carefully maintained composure. "Clara sent me," Roy said simply. "She thought it might be better coming from someone who's not scared of you." Delacroix chuckled lowly, shaking his head. "You'd better get to the point." "Boy, I didn't come all the way out here for games." Roy pulled the journal page out, slowly unfolding it with deliberate precision. He stepped closer, laying it flat on the table in front of the judge. Delacroix's expression shifted ever so slightly as he read the handwriting he hadn't seen in over 50 years, his daughter's scrawl frustratingly defiant. Even now, the mask cracked, his jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened, and for a moment a shadow crossed his face, something wounded but not unfamiliar. Then, all at once, it vanished, replaced by a sneer that carried malice sharp enough to draw blood. "You really think you're going to rewrite history, boy?" Delacroix said coldly, his voice low but filled with menace. Roy's stare didn't waver. "I'm not rewriting it," he said firmly, just finally reading it aloud. The judge leaned back in his chair, now his hand brushing faintly against the edge of the pistol on the table. Though he didn't lift it, his eyes locked on Roy with a dangerous intensity. "You think I'm ashamed? You think I regret what happened? Let me tell you something." His voice turned sharp, unwavering. "Now I saved her, saved our name. That girl would have died in sin tied to that boy." Roy's voice cut in louder. "Now you killed your own daughter." The judge didn't falter. His smile widened, venomous. "She stopped being my daughter the moment she kissed him on church steps." The words hung in the air like a sickness heavy and unbearable. But Roy didn't flinch. He couldn't. He stayed silent for a moment, letting the confession spill into the room, sinking into every crevice. It was enough. Outside of the rustle of boots in the grass was faint at first, but soon the door burst open. Hayes and Joyner entering with flashlights blazing and weapons drawn. The judge didn't move. He didn't fight. He stood stiffly, his shoulders squared as if facing an audience at some grand finale. "Then let history judge me too," he said calmly as the agents cuffed him, his composure unbroken. The trap had sprung, and this time history wouldn't be overwritten. The courthouse stood unusually quiet. The day Albert DeLua was indicted outside the usual streaming noise of small-town life had taken on a different tone. Softer and murmur-filled, like everyone was waiting for the next chapter, without wanting to draw attention to themselves. Inside, Roy sat behind a row of government suits, sharp-eyed prosecutors who had taken over long before the Delqua name really started sweating. Federal charges spoke louder than local ambition, and once the dust from the investigation had cleared, the indictment felt inevitable. Civil rights violations and conspiracy to commit murder. Judge Delqua, however, seemed as immovable as ever. Even in cuffs, his face still carried his trademark smugness. But there was Ware, there now, hidden in the corners of his mouth. His sharp jaw no longer rose with the same viciousness, his back straight. Yes, but even a man, like Delqua, could feel the ground shifting under him. Despite decades of power, he now sat on the wrong side of the law. Roy studied him closely, resisting the urge to react as Delqua turned his head ever so slightly to meet his gaze. The stare wasn't one of guilt. It was annoyance, as if Delqua couldn't believe Roy had pulled so much out of the riverbed and rubble of decades past. The formalities lasted barely an hour. Key evidence reviewed a statement from the prosecuting attorney. Read aloud, Isaiah's name came up repeatedly, alongside Evelyn's sparking faint murmurs each time. By the time the judge remanded him to custody awaiting trial, Delqua wasn't coughing up any kind of fight. His expression hadn't changed even then, offering neither surrender nor pride as he was escorted back out of the courtroom. The call came 2 weeks later, reverberating through Roy's kitchen in sharp, urgent tones. It wasn't the kind of call Roy expected, but then again, nothing about this case had followed the rules. He picked up the receiver, resting it against his unshaven face as the other line poured out. What small facts they had, Albert DeCrow pronounced dead early this morning. The voice crackled faintly. Roy barely responded, a tightening in his chest overriding any impulse for politeness. Initial reports saying cardiac arrest found collapsed in his holding cell during early morning rounds. Medical examiners on it should have a full report in days, but they didn't believe it either. Roy thought he hadn't even finished the sentence. The rumors began the moment the news hit an old man succumbing to stress. Sure, maybe it was the weight of his guilt, but other whispers crept quickly into the conversation. Whispers of hands in the shadows of someone silencing Delqua before he could speak. Names greater than his own, some talked about foul play. Others, a quiet suicide. The truth? It hung somewhere in the air, impossible to pin down. The river ran quieter than usual that day, a barely audible whisper behind the small crowd gathered on neutral land by its bank. The remains of Isaiah Walker and Evelyn Delqua remained a point of contention among some, but to those who had fought those who had lost, they knew this wasn't a compromise, it was a victory. Their resting place wasn't in consecrated family plots or some distant burial, where shame could distort the truth. They were laid side by side, no barriers in life and none now in death, on a patch of land big enough to belong to no one and sacred enough to belong to both. The service wasn't grand by any standard, it wasn't meant to be. But there was beauty in its simplicity, a gentle glowing assurance that the fight for justice had pulled them into the light. Finally, wooden caskets sat low into the earth as hymns passed from faint lips in the crowd above the sunlight, filtered through the canopy of trees dappling the plain markers that bore their names. Isaiah and Evelyn etched together for eternity. Roy leaned back against his truck at the edge of the service, watching with steady discomfort. This wasn't his moment to lead, but one to witness. Dorothy stood near the grave, smaller than usual, but no less composed. She didn't cry. Instead, she walked forward when the moment came and laid a single white magnolia flower at the foot of Isaiah's grave. They thought silence could bury them, she said softly, her voice calm but cutting through the weight in the air with ease. But love endures. She stepped back into the crowd, letting her truth settle in with her words. After the last hymn, Clara Hensley approached the graves in her hands, a framed sheet of paper creased faintly at the edges but pressed flat under the glass. It was the letter Evelyn left her all those years ago, the same one that got her the justice she deserved without ceremony. She knelt down and gently rested it in the center, leaning it against the dirt and stone. Clara stood and walked back toward Dorothy, the crowd beginning to disperse in mournful silence. Roy stayed where he was, his eyes scanning the funeral scene one more time. A faint breeze pushed through the trees, carrying with it the sounds of a town that had begun to whisper long before justice came knocking. Later that day, Roy sat quietly on Dorothy's front porch as the evening folded in around them. Dorothy's hands rested on Isaiah's Bible, which now sat in her lap, its cover newly restored. The stains had been cleaned, the edges repaired, but the weight of its contents, the scriptures Isaiah had held on to so dearly, remained. "You know, this was his favorite book," Dorothy said at last, her voice soft but strong enough to cut through the quiet. "It tucked under his arm, no matter where he went. I always thought he'd wear it out, the way he flipped through those pages." Roy smiled faintly, resting his elbows on his knees, his posture loose in a way he hadn't felt in months. He probably thought it had lasted forever. He said Dorothy smiled at that small but sincere, before lapsing into silence again. She turned the Bible over in her lap, pressing her palm flat against its cover, like she could feel Isaiah's presence seeping through it. "Roy," she started quiet but deliberate. "You did what I couldn't do for 12 years. I waited, but you made it, so people finally listened." Roy shook his head, his eyes meeting hers as she looked up at him. "No, ma'am," he said plainly. "You kept believing when it felt like the whole world didn't. That's what brought this home. You never let their memory fade." He let the words hang for a moment, their weight settling between them. Dorothy held his gaze for a long beat, tears gathering faintly in the corners of her eyes but never spilling. She let out a soft laugh, half bitter, half light, like relief tinged with pain. "Believing isn't much without someone to carry it forward," she whispered, her voice breaking just slightly. Roy reached out, resting a steady hand over hers where it clutched the Bible. "You carried it far enough." He said. The late afternoon light burned low behind Roy as he pulled back onto the main road, heading south. The sun glinted sharply off his windshield, casting long shadows behind, while the red dirt from the path kicked up in his wake, throwing a cloud of dust that caught the golden light before fading back into the air. His hands gripped the wheel firmly, though not with tension, just a sense of direction, a purpose as steady as the hum of the tires beneath him. As the last stretch of Magnolia Hill disappeared in his rear view, Roy felt the road stretching ahead like a promise, open and unbroken. Justice wasn't perfect, but truth was no longer buried, and that Roy thought was worth every mile. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.